have some, in fact, an individual doing what the Fed did, and that was JP Morgan, right? So, if you want, the point is not, in my opinion, the point would not be to get rid of the Fed, but to democratize the Fed. And if you have, instead of, if you don't want to do that, be ready for the next, to have very directly, the next time a crisis happens, to be Goldman Sachs themselves who are going to be the arbiters of what's going to happen. So you should ask for a much more serious democratization of the Fed. Remember, the Fed is a creature of Congress. It can make it, it can unmake it, it can control it, right? The Fed has used its all legal mannerisms, all kinds of legal mannerisms to circumvent the democratic process. That should not be the case. There are central banks all over the world which function well, right? The Fed for the most part has not over the last 25 years, and it's time to change that.
Can you give us an example of a bank that's worked really well in another country? So if we want to do our own case study,
all right,
we can see.
There's many banks around the world.
Yeah.
It really depends on what your desiderata are. So, for example, there are banks such as, let me just give you an example. The Bank of India has made it very clear that banks could not, that the banks under their control could not lend against real estate beyond a certain amount of time. They were very cognizant of certain bad behaviors. And if you listen to the Fed chairman, the Reserve Bank chairman, he says, look, if you give people a chance to behave badly, they will behave badly. What do you expect? Right? So there are good policymakers all over the world who are good in this way. There are places to look at, Bank of Canada, other places. Yes.
Very, very well.
About war.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on your comments about the Federal Reserve, and it seems like there's a very good reason why fiscal policy and monetary policy are so clearly separated in most central banks, and it would seem like most of the versions of democratizing our monetary policy would involve making the monetary and the fiscal policy closer.
Yes.
So,
all right. So there's
don't we think there's a danger?
So there's a concern here about what's sometimes called a political business cycle, which is that the Fed, for many reasons, people have believed that keeping a central bank separate from the government is a good idea, because if it's not the case, the central bank has sometimes got to take unpleasant decisions which will never be taken by. Is that broadly the idea? Now, and if you democratize the Fed, they'll never do that. So there's kind of two responses to that. What do you want the Fed to do? Right? Do you want the Fed to actually respond broadly to the kind of concerns of the people in this case? In which case they would have much more of a mandate to look at unemployment rather than inflation. That is actually a political question as opposed to a technocratic question. The technocratic question is, should the Fed be kind of sealed away so that they can undertake certain decisions and undertake certain important, if unpalatable decisions? You can still do that, and the way you do that is to give them a mandate. Some countries have mandates saying keep inflation targeting at a certain percent, keep inflation targets at say 3% or 2%, and then the Fed goes out and does that, or the central bank goes out and does that, and that's their only mandate. But that can be changed, and that can be changed by various kind of decisions of government, of Congress, whatever that is.
So the Fed in the United States both sets the targets and makes the policy to achieve the targets.
Yes.
And
Yes.
saying that
So the Fed is
the
actually...
democratization would be by
okay,
giving them targets.
No. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the Fed has been, in this particular country, the history of the Fed is a little unusual in that it is a creature of the private banks. In many other countries, it is not. So when I say democratization, I mean that you have the structure of the Fed such that its primary personnel don't come directly from those banks. For example, I have the interest of the banking system at its core, right? And there are many ways to do that. The kind of larger question that you're asking is a much more complicated, I think a real question about whether you should have some sort of separation of policies. I think that in this country, the problem is not too much, but too little of democracy over the Fed. Direct control over what the Fed does. An ability to ask the Fed why it's undertaking certain decisions. So for example, as you know, in the decision to bail out AIG, it took a lot of effort to figure out where that money went. That shouldn't be the case, right? Especially if it's putting the taxpayer on the hook. There is one question about war. If you take a look at the long-range impact of government spending on the economy, there's two policies which have been the most destructive for the fiscal health of the economy. The first is wars, unfunded wars, and the second is the tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts of 2002. Maybe you want to look at the other picture in one of the documents that I gave you. I'm sorry to put it back. It's my teacher coming out in me, right? But if
that was our chant in the march today. What do you do about the deficit?
So I want
Stop the wars and tax the rich.
Take a look at this picture, right? That tells you what was the cost to the US of extending tax cuts for the upper income brackets and comparing it over the appropriate time to how much of a shortfall there is in Social Security. Guess what? You could cover that. Right? So all the worries about Social Security. Now, I'm old enough to remember that the Bush-Gore debates in which Gore was mercilessly mocked for the lockbox, right? From Saturday Night Live. Now think about this. I think it's turned out to be right because those tax cuts could have funded Social Security and would not have this kind of debate that we're having right now. So wars and tax cuts have been the most unfunded wars and tax cuts have been the most destructive to fiscal health of the economy.
Found it.
I point out that you make Social Security taxes progressive.
Right.
And you could also cover that shortfall. You wouldn't have to look at the income tax as much.
Right.
Raise the cap.
Right. So you could raise the cap on Social Security, and that
down to 100,000 or so, and anything beyond that you don't pay.
yes. So
Arjun, can you
as you
repeat the
know, the
question?
Social Security is capped at a certain level. I forget what it is now. $106,000 a year now. Anyone who makes above that, you're not paying anything more progressively into Social Security. Sorry?
Did the Fed actually institute the recession in 1982 in order to break inflation?
Yes.
And the benefit to that was actually to corporate America rather than to the individual.
It's interesting. Actually, the people who suffered the most from that were not in this country. They were in Latin America. You created a decade of destruction in Latin America from what happened here. That was actually, if the kind of destruction that you saw in Latin America was domestic, you would have had a much bigger angry response at the recession of the 80s. But it was considered very popular at that particular point of time because it got rid of inflation, which was damaging people's real wage over the last few years.
But you could also, the consumer was almost effectively winning, even though they're paying 15% inflation, their interest rate was 17%, so that they were on the plus side,
yes.
But the money was on the negative side, so they kind of used Reagan to lean on the Fed to engineer this, right?
Okay, this is... Wait.
All right. So the question is, if I understand the question, for whom was Reagan acting? Is that broadly the kind of question?
For whom does it Reagan? You see that they have a difficult time exerting influence on the Fed, and I was just using that as an example of maybe where they were able to do it.
Yeah. Look,
Okay, all right.
They didn't like the fact that
I don't know what you said. All right, but the question is who benefited the most from that? There is, and was there not a political pressure towards that? And the answer is yes, there was a political pressure towards that. And this is not a secret. One of the nice things about disclosure is that you can actually read Fed minutes. Of course, 7 years after the fact, but the business historians who have looked at the kind of decisions that have been made. And I urge you to take a look. I'll leave my email here and I will send out to anyone who's interested some papers where people have gone through the minutes of the Fed. And it's very clear that they're not interested at that point in making sure unemployment is low. They want inflation down because the real rates of interest are not good enough for a group which we might call rentiers right now, right?
Thank you.
I'm going to make do a mic check real quick to update everyone on what's going on right now.
Sure.
Thanks.
Can you give me a good timeout?
All right.
The march!
Left here!
The left here
is at North Station!
is at North Station.
They're going to hop on the Zaka Bridge!
They're gonna
They're going to jump on the Zaka Bridge!
They're gonna jump on the Zaka Bridge
Shut it down!
and shut it down.
What we are doing
What we are doing
is expanding our camp!
is expanding our camp.
If you have a tent here,
If you have a tent here
and you would like more room,
and you would like more room,
follow us!
follow us.
We're going over there!
Because we're going over there.
You're not jumping off the Zaka.
Yeah. The point that is being made is a correct point that it was Carter, not Reagan. I should actually have said it was the Volcker recession because it just coincided at that point of time. That is the first point. Right.
The second point is to understand the Fed's what we call reaction function. That's what they do. One of the key variables is unemployment duration. And when the duration of unemployment gets small, the Fed triggers recessions because it doesn't like the upward pressure. So it's very it's much more connected with labor market developments than the standard discourse would ever
Yes. Okay. So I just want to repeat that.
Great.
Whenever the unemployment duration becomes long, this is when the unemployment duration gets long, the Fed has a reaction function to that, and the Fed then raises interest rates at that point of time, right? Sorry, when unemployment duration gets short. Okay, let me do that again. Sorry, when unemployment duration gets short, it basically is a situation where there's upward pressure on wages, and because there's upward pressure on wages, prices go up, and so a very strong predictor of whether the Fed will raise interest rates is how long or short the unemployment duration is. I should just say that this is actually a very strong statistical relationship. There are not many people who have actually written about it in great detail, in very convincing detail, but that person is one of them, right? And you should read her work on this. Yes. Right.
Where's the book? Tell her name.
She is Julie Shore.
What's the name of the book?
There are many papers she's written on this. So.
What's the name of the book? Sorry.
The name of the last one is True Well.
The last book she's written is True Well, but there's many other interesting ones like The Overworked American and The Overspent American, which you should read. And I'll stop plugging her because she's going to feel embarrassed about it.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the bank bailouts that happened just as the recession was starting.
Yes.
It's now a popular thing both on the left and the right to criticize the bailout. At the time, they were saying it was going to be an even bigger catastrophe if they didn't do it, which is why they rushed it through. So, what do you think about it? How would you have done differently?
Look, this is a very difficult question. Because you're dealing with a counterfactual, what would have happened if there wasn't a bailout? Right? And I think well-meaning people have many disagreements about this. I have my own opinion. My own opinion is that you would have had a bad situation if you did not have the bailout. Right? But right from the beginning, it was very clear that the bailout had to be done in a different way. And this is not post facto people saying, it should have, we didn't know at that time, but we would have done it. At that time, people were saying it's a wrong thing to mistake a solvency crisis for a liquidity crisis, which is basically to say the banks were insolvent, they were bankrupt, they should have been taken over, people who were shareholders in the bank should have been liquidated, people who the bank owed bondholders should have been given a haircut, which means they should have gotten lower returns, and you would have created a much healthier banking system and also not lost so much political capital at that point of time. That didn't happen, and that's part of what this is all about. I wouldn't want to get that righteous anger is right, whether it's from the left or the right. They were right about that. Sorry?
Wouldn't that have wiped out a whole bunch of people whose pensions were locked up in all of that?
There are losses to be made. When the losses are definitely going to happen, right? But who is going to take the losses? And it should not be the people who are. It should not be the people who have gone into the business of banking who are bailed out. They've actually shown themselves to have failed in their job. At that point of time, you don't reward them. You don't say, "Oh, it's okay, right? We'll make you whole." You say, "You've made a mistake. You're out." Right? If we are going to kind of come in and save your hides, we get to take control. It happened in that way in other countries. Britain, for example, that's what they did. It was just a political decision here to not do that. And now you'll hear people. I don't know if some of you saw that really irritating CNN segment with Erin Burnett went around saying, "Oh, we made money on the TARP. Isn't that good?" Right? Right? That was wrong in so many levels, because even from her perspective, which would be a purely capitalist perspective, the correct thing to have done at that point of time is to liquidate the shareholders. Right? So it's a question of how you did what you did at that point of time, according to me. Other people would have said, "Let them fail." I don't know what would have happened. I think there would have been a worse catastrophe.
This is why you really stay here to get a chin.
Any other questions?
So the problem isn't the bailout, the problem is the way the bailout was handled.
Yes.
Chop the banks
Let's
up.
let some other people talk.
Many guys from the IMF were handled in Sweden in the 90s. There was that expert capital to rely upon to chop this stuff down.
Yes.
And they, in 1950 they expanded the FDIC mandate to include this idea that maybe we will inject some moral hazard to the system.
I think what he's saying is it's not that this was not known. There have been bailouts all over the world, right? In fact, if you remember, Obama said, people look at Sweden, we're not Sweden. It's true, but you could learn something from them, right? And I think that was what, I think that's broadly what you're saying. There have been many kind of situations in which these kind of decisions have had to be made. And it's not something either new or something in which people could say, we made a mistake because we didn't know. They knew at that point in time what they were doing. Yes.
Boy number 6 here.
Do you have any idea how much taxpayers has been spent so far to solve this? I'm confused by now. I've heard so many numbers.
Right.
It started with like 700 billion.
Yeah.
But I have heard some people are talking about 2 billion.
All right. So the question is, how much of taxpayer money has actually been spent on this to solve this crisis? There would be, if we believe the crisis was solved, which we don't right now, it depends on how you parse it, but let's say that you would want to add the stimulus money that has been spent, right? So say $700 billion. The money that was spent to bail out the counterparties of AIG, which are not getting back about $180 billion. And then there are other ways in which bailouts have happened, which people don't speak about. And which is very hard to quantify. For example, the Fed, because the federal funds rate, the rate at which banks can borrow is so low, they're basically getting virtually free money. And where are they spending it? They're spending it on trading and commodity bubbles, things which make it much more expensive. It's very hard to quantify that particular amount, but in the bare minimum is close to $1 trillion.
Just to expand on that,
these
guys have about $16 trillion in outstanding loans to the current banking system, but they haven't collected on it. So when he's talking about writing checks at low interest, That's all going around in churn right now. That's all being used to shore up balance sheets so that people can actually borrow money in theory, but not in practice.
That's right.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the potential or lack thereof for DoddFrank to amend some of the structural problems within the financial system so that moving forward we don't have problems such as the 2008 financial crisis.
All right, so this is the true wonk question. DoddFrank bill, which people have heard of but no one knows.
I haven't heard of it. I don't know what it is.
The Dodd-Frank bill is kind of the cornerstone bill which is supposed to deal with financial crisis and financial regulation from here on out, right? And the question is, can it prevent something like this from happening again? Look,
the American Recovery Reinvestment Act? Or is that something?
No, this is not the ARRA. This is not the stimulus. This is as of yet it's something that's sparked. It's as of yet an ambiguous policy. And I'll tell you a little bit why. People are debating a very key part of it, which may or may not come online. You've seen people walk around with something that says "Bring back Glass-Steagall," right? And that's a policy which is a policy which separates certain functions of the banking system. It's not clear whether that is actually going to be in place in a really functional way. There's a lot of debate about that. What I think is the biggest problem is that I find it hard to believe that with the kind of banking concentration that you have now, which has actually grown, that if there is a real crisis like this, you will not have very severe consequences again.
That was a new deal, 430s, wasn't it?
The Glass-Steagall, yes, was in the 30s.
For the record, though, I think it looks like Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, these guys, those are banks.
Right.
The restrictions on retail banking held by Glass-Steagall wouldn't have stopped that.
No, that's right. But universal banking certainly created a bigger mess by bringing deposits into the system that it would be front side. All right, so the broader, but I think for me the key question really is has too big to fail been actually conquered? And I don't think that has happened at all. I certainly don't think that's the case.
Can you please talk a little bit about the difference between the bailout, if you will, of the financial and banking industry versus the inability for the failure to, if you will, bail out the manufacturing?
Okay.
And the collapse of manufacturing.
That's actually a very interesting question. So for those of you who didn't hear, the question is, can you talk about the difference between the bailouts of the financial industry and the bailouts of manufacturing, like GM and so on? I think it's become, there used to be a time when, I don't know who came up with this statement, it's a statement which I know from American popular history. What's good for GM is good for America.
That was the CEO of GM.
GM, right? And there was a book, there was a paper that came out recently which had the title "What's Good for Goldman Sachs is Good for America." Right? Now, why was that paper named that? It's basically a change in the political economy where the kind of key industry of the states has moved from being manufacturing to being the financial sector, right? And when that happens, the kind of concerns of government, the natural, if you will, the natural power brokers are now is now the financial sector. So what happened differentially? Well, what you notice that happened very interestingly is that the kind of policies, the kind of hard-nosed policies that were followed in the kind of limited bailouts of the auto industry were not followed with the financial sector. It was much more hands-off approach to the financial sector, right? And that's just a reflection of, I think, the underlying power structure in that particular case, right?
Just to follow up, didn't they pretty much take over GM, restructure it, put it back together, and it went brilliantly?
You know, I shouldn't speak. You should say a little bit more about that because I don't know all the details about what happened to GM. Do you have any insight about exactly the policy? It's been some time.
It was a full takeover, and it was a structured bankruptcy, but they basically kept the industrial sector in order. They refitted they're actually making money, but it's amusing that the source of the money is actually sales in China. They're treading water in the States, but they're still here. They've saved I don't know how many million jobs by actually bailing us out. That's an example of lemon socialism that made a delicious lemonade there.
Okay, thank you. It's always good to have people who know these details in the crowd, right?
Could you follow up and talk a little bit more about the force multiplication effect of what you said? You know, the hands-off approach.
Right.
Does it have any kind of? It must have some kind of force multiplication effect in the banking or financial world.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what is the force.
Government's hands-off approach.
Yeah.
Towards the financial and banking industry as opposed to their insisting on the letter of the law, if you will.
Right.
So, what kind of force multiplying effect does it have in the private sector, in the financial world?
Oh, you mean who is benefited, or what is the force multiplying?
How much of a force multiplication effect is their hands-off approach on the financial and banking?
If I understand,
does it allow them to like this gentleman was saying, have like zero interest-free loans, which obviously is.
I see.
You know what I mean?
So what are the other kind of things that it... No, it's my fault, I wasn't comprehending exactly. So the question, if I understand correctly, is what are the other kind of things which allow for the financial sector to be bailed out while in a kind of hands-off way?
Yes.
So are there the backdoor bailouts, in other words, that are going on? Yes, so for example, this federal funds rate that I was telling you, the rate at which banks can borrow from other banks, so rather from the Federal Reserve, is very low. It's a very, very low rate of interest. So they can borrow and spend and lend on whichever way. What you'll notice is that your credit card debt is not becoming any cheaper. Your credit card interest is not becoming any cheaper. Right? And you could imagine that lower interest that they're borrowing would get transferred on. That's not happening. There are many ways in which there are probably things going on, such as, for example, foreclosures and policies towards household affordability that would suggest that if you were really hard-nosed, you would force the banks to say, all right, forgive a lot of debt of households, take the losses on, and become clean over time. But none of that is happening. So there's many different ways in which they're actually being supported, which is not directly to a bailout. So, all right. Any other questions?
Yeah, is that realistic what you say about the forgiving debt?
Yes.
Is that politically possible?
Debt forgiveness happens all the time. It's totally and completely possible, right? And I think there's...
Sorry, could you just say that one thing again? Because that was really key.
Debt forgiveness happens all the time. It's totally possible, right? Would it be prudent? So this is an interesting thing, right?
I mean, if I'm taking the loss on it, yes. I'm not in favor.
Right. So this is an interesting question, right? When you have a crisis, someone is going to pay. Right? Now the question is, can you do it? Can you manage it in such a way in which the people who either overextend themselves, the people who are who made the mistake, pay first? Yes, you can find some ways. Now there are some ways in which you're going to actually have to realize that money is not going to come back, and you're going to have to figure out ways. This happens all the time under capitalism, right? You have loans which are not going to come back in that particular period of time. You find ways of rolling over debt. That's what banks do all the time.
Can I say something to follow you up? I was just reading an economist that said in the last 4 years, the 13,500, if you will, richest American families lost about 11.1% of their total wealth, whereas the rest of the population lost a whopping 37%. So the wealth is actually transferred upwards.
I don't think there's any argument that the wealth has been transferred upwards for... How long has the wealth been transferred upward in this country?
If you take the share of the top 1% of the... Since we're talking 99% and 1%, I think it's a good number actually. If you take the share of the top 1%, it was the highest in 2007 that it has been since records were actually kept. Right.
get wealthier, you know, it doesn't take anything away from people down below.
Right.
I don't believe that, but I don't have anything to back my thoughts up.
All right. So here's the question is, this is what about trickle down? Broadly, is it when the rich get richer, won't the just make the pie larger, or as I think Bush said, Bush said, make the pie higher, I believe, right? Is the phrase that he gave. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the idea that you could actually have a situation where the rich get richer faster than the poor get rich. Now, you might want to ask whether that's a healthy economy in the first place, but you can make that statement. But it turns out that that's not what's happening in the US, right? What's happening in the US is that real wages have been stagnant since the 60s and actually been falling since the 60s. If you take a picture, and again, all of these are things that I can actually make pictures for people and send around if people are interested at all. And we can make a book or a scrapbook about these pictures. Take a look at wage growth and productivity growth, right? Wage growth has been going like this. Productivity growth has been going like that. Now, typically what you should have is that wages keep up with productivity, right? You produce more, but then you get higher wages. Not the case, right? So what has been happening in this last, I would say the last 20 years, is a kind of polarization of wages. There's been a big fall in the wage rate of the middle income groups relative to the top, right? And it's not really a question of the bottom 10 and the top 90. It's really the middle which has suffered the most.